Hi, I'm Ross Bentley.
Hi, I'm Jeff Braun, and
this is No Dumb Questions. Great intro there, right, Jeff?
Well, that's like you said, Ross. It's the hardest part of this whole recording process is timing that right. I think we're getting better. I'm not sure. Please don't go back and listen to the past ones, but we're going to say we're getting better.
Good thing racing has nothing to do with timing.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we have a couple of interesting questions. They're not dumb. So we'll see what we can do to dumb them down maybe or something.
Right. So at least you and I can understand them.
Yeah. Actually, the first question I'm going to ask you, Jeff, is there's actually two questions that are very, very similar. I'll read the first question. It comes from Justin Libson, and he says, how do I start to approach car setup as an amateur endurance racer? As you both have experienced, most times these cars do not have much in the way of adjustments. And then we have a second question from Pete, and Pete goes into a lot of detail of what he's gone from a Porsche 924 to a Porsche 944 turbo and different shocks and bars and wings and all sorts of different things and all sorts of details on his setup. And I think in one way he would love for you to say, put this shock on here and this spring here and this wing angle here. But I think ultimately he's looking for the same thing that Justin's talking about is how do we even approach that? Like, where do I start? What's the procedure? What's the process?
Right. That's you and I have done a lot of seminars and a lot of talks together and stuff like that and webinars and it kind of, I think it amazes us on the surface that people are like, well, I got this specific car. Tell me what camber, what shock settings, what bars to run. And we're like, I'm certainly like, I have no idea. I've never run a 944 turbo. I wouldn't really know where to start. But if I had a 944 turbo and I'd never seen one before, that's happened to me a lot. I've had LMP3 cars, LMP2, GTD. I mean, I've had a long list of cars that I've never run before, and they don't come with a magic setup. Nobody sends that to me. So I got to figure it out. And it's the same process that I would use when I got our LMP3 car or LMP2 car that Pete or Justin would use. It's exactly the same process. And it's for me, the first obvious thing is if you have a car that's been a race car before, you bought it from somebody who raced it, and hopefully they've had some success, or at least they've manipulated the setup around to what they think is decent. And I would never try to reinvent that. I would try to start with some base. You need some base. If you've had a car that you've run for 2 years and you're taking it out for the first time this year and you're going to really work on setup, start with that same setup you've always run. If you have a car, like in Pete's case, where it's brand new and you've never driven it before, go with whatever the guy who sold it to you, what he thought was his best setup. It's probably not going to be for him. For Pete, it's not going to be the best setup, but it's something to start with. Then compile whatever you can afford to buy to change, whatever is allowed to change. Some classes are so tightly regulated that you're not allowed to change very much. Some of them are just difficult, like it takes 2 hours to change a spring on certain cars. Well, don't worry about that. Don't worry about buying springs, but collect the tools and parts that you can change. And that will kind of define what you're going to work with, right? If all you have is a tire pressure gauge and an air tank, and that's it, well, that's what you're going to focus on changing. Right. You're not going to worry about the springs and the bump rubbers and the shock adjustments. You're going to work with what you got. So look at that. And if I'm doing an LMP3 car for Core Autosport, I have whatever I want. I'm super lucky. But not everybody is in that same situation. So gather what you can go change, and then go to the racetrack, drive the car around, make some detailed notes. You always propose track maps and writing things down corner by corner. We'll write down, not maybe you have two different track maps, or maybe it's in one, but one is for your driving things, what you can do better, and the other one's for how the car's handling, because you have this new project that you're going to make your car handle better this year. So put the car handling, understeer on entry, understeer on entry, and you'll see what the problem is, right? And if the problem is the problem that you don't like, and you don't have to be an expert at it, it's what frustrates you. Not that another driver might jump in and have a different opinion, but whatever frustrating you in those corners is what's holding you back. So we need to do two things: adjust your driving so it doesn't frustrate you, but also adjust the car so it's easier to go around the corner without that frustration. And then just look at what you have. Okay, all I've got is a tire pressure gauge, and it understeers all the time. Well, that probably means I don't have very much front grip. What would I do? Probably lower my tire pressure, because that would give me more grip on my front tires. So take some tire pressure out of the front and go drive again and see if that's better. And if it's better, but now your tires you think it's scaring you because they're too low in the front, because you don't know if they can take that load, well, and it still understeers, well, you could add air to the rear and make it slide around a little bit more, and maybe that helps. And so it's the same process that I use when I have all the tools. Get the driver out there. What doesn't he like? Start working on that thing. And if at the end of the weekend you still did your tire pressures and everything, and you still have understeer, then you can go back and go, okay, well, tire pressures won't fix it. I can't get it to fix the tire pressures. So maybe I have to buy some springs, or maybe I have anti-roll bars that I can get a softer one for the front, or maybe, but I do have adjustable shocks. I never noticed that. Okay, well, maybe I can make the front softer so it makes grip, or whatever. So don't worry about getting a big pile of parts that you have to have. Go find out what the problem is. And that's what most people miss. They're looking for some magic setup. There is no magic setup.
Yeah. And you and I have talked about this when we've done the webinars about handling and tuning and the car's setup and things like that in the past, is probably one of the mistakes it seems like is a lot of drivers, they don't define the problem well enough. They might go, well, it understeers. Well, where? Is it in the slow corners, or is it in the fast corners? Is it when you turn in, or is it when you're up going back to power? Because those are all different. They're different problems that need different solutions, correct?
Exactly. And the more detailed you can get, and the better you'll be. You're trying to build this kind of database of what happens, and you'll see then reoccurring themes, and you'll see, well, it always understeers on the entry from a long straightaway to a slow corner. Okay. Well, then you just kind of think about it, and you don't have to be an expert. Again, it'll kind of gravitate to what you can change, what you have available to you. But you need those, like you said, you need the details, because understeer in the middle of the corner is way different than understeer on the entry to the corner. And, you just, I know I'm saying, well, it'll kind of be self-evident on what to change. I have a lot of experience. So to me, what's self-evident maybe comes easier than to somebody who's new, but still you're looking for what the problem is. Don't chase that magic setup. There is no magic setup. If I went with Pete with his 944 turbo to the first test, I would say, Pete, put on whatever you think is the best setup. And he'd be, I don't know. It came with this setup. Perfect. Let's go run that. And I would say, bring whatever you got: springs, bars, shocks, shock adjustments. Now, the easy thing is, if you really don't know, and it's like a brand new car, or the guy had no idea, or whatever, this is going to sound crazy, but I do things like this quite often. The first time I ran an LMP3 car, I set all the shocks to the middle. I set all the anti-roll bars to the middle. I had a range of springs. I put all the springs I put on were all the ones in the middle of the stiffness range. I had a wing. I put the rear wing full maximum because I knew that was safe. It wasn't going to spin out and surprise somebody. And then I knew that was going to be too much wing. But we went out there and they went, wow, it understeers like crazy in high speed corners. Perfect. Take some wing out. So when in doubt, put stuff in the middle, and on tire pressures, the same way, kind of ask around. And if you're not sure, run a little more than what everybody says, 3-4 pounds to start out with. Then, you can always sneak it down on the end that's sliding around the most. You can come down on the pressures. So there's, if you bought your 944 turbo from the guy that just won the runoffs with it, now I'd start with that setup. That's probably going to be pretty darn close and go from there. If you just built the thing from a junker and bolted it all together, you don't really know. So put everything in the middle and go out and run it and see what you got.
Well, and you mentioned ask around, and I don't want this to come across the wrong way, but I've been at a lot of Porsche events, and there's always that. Well, I had so and so shop put the setup on my car, and like that's the setup. And then somebody else has got the same car, and they're like, yeah, but I had another shop do it, and that's the right setup. So how much of that do you listen to? And, can two expert shops have two different setups that work?
I had a friend of mine that used to say, it's okay to go ask somebody else what their setup is, as long as you never believe them.
Right.
And that's kind of, I can give you an example, a current example. At Core, we're running an LMP3 car. One of our biggest competitors is Bill Riley at Riley Motorsports. They're running an LMP3 car. Their drivers are different than my drivers. I guarantee you, both of these expert shops have different setups. And we run the same lap time and we compete tooth and nail side to side pod for wins. They're not the same setup. So what one expert shop says is a good setup and the other says is a good setup, they're probably, they do know something about that car, right? So pick one. And again, we said it's the right setup as long as you don't believe it. So it's something to start from. It's going to get you probably closer than you would get. And then go out and tune it for you, your driving style, the tires that you have on the car, the way you drive the car, how hard you push the car, how much fuel's in the car. Tune it to what you like, because the best setup, the magic setup, is the one that you can drive the fastest. Endurance racing teaches you that a lot. You have 3-4 drivers often. And at the high levels of IMSA, I guarantee you every one of those cars, the setup on every one of those cars is a compromise. None of the 4 drivers likes it perfectly. But on the good teams, they've all compromised because it's best for everyone. So that's by way of saying, if one shop says this is the best setup, it might be for one guy, but not for another guy, not for you. So all you need is a starting place. Don't get too caught up in what's the best setup, because the best setup is the one that works best for you. That's what you're looking for, not the magic 944 turbo setup. You're looking for the magic 944 turbo setup that Pete can drive like crazy.
And then we get into the situation where a lot of amateurs, a test day, whoa, wouldn't that be nice? We basically show up, we get one practice session, we start a race. And so it's kind of tuning on the fly.
Yeah. It just compresses it. It just compresses what you can do. If you've done an endurance race, I've done some jump car, champ car, world endurance kind of races before. And you got enough time to change some tire pressures. That you can do. Yeah. So you could play around a little bit there. We do that in IMSA races. We change tire pressures on pit stops. The next set going on is different ones based on what the drivers told us. That's about all we can really change in an IMSA car nowadays. You don't even have cockpit adjustable anti-roll bars in any class other than DPI. So, there's not a whole lot you can change. But what you need to do is the minute that race is over, do your track map, write down what you didn't like, and start thinking about the next race and what you would try. And if you get a practice session, try something. Try a different anti-roll bar setting or a different shock setting or something like that. And then the ultimate thing is, and this is, I think, is the fun part. Once one of those races start, if your setup isn't good, figure out a way to drive around it. That's where you come in. It's like, though, I guarantee you, when a big time race starts, none of the cars are handling perfect to their driver's liking. None of them are. The drivers that can adapt to that the best are the guys that win and figure out what the track's done, what the handling done, how they've missed the setup, whatever, and they figured out a way to adapt to it and drive around that. Those are the guys that win the races. And that's probably more important than finding that magic setup, because the magic setup never lasts very long.
Well, so I'm gonna try to narrow this down to one last little bit here, and then we'll move on. But let's pretend you have a production-based car. It could be an old 944 turbo. It could be a new, a new spec Miata. I mean, it could be, anything in between all that kind of stuff. It could be a new Porsche Cayman or something like that. And you are going to go and do one of these endurance races. And yeah, there isn't a lot you can do, but, you could change ride height a little bit. You could change maybe a wing angle on a Porsche or something like that, or a 944 turbo. You can change tire pressures. You can change any roll bars. You can, you've got some knobs on the shocks. And it's a brand new car to you. Do you have a preference of where you start? I'm always going to start with the tires and then work from there, or I'm always going to start with the dampers and then work from there, or I'm always going to start with camber and toe or something like that. Do you have a preference of, just from your experience, do you have a preference of where you prefer to start?
I would say if you have what I would call an aerodynamic car. So if it has a wing on the back and it's a real wing, it's not just decoration, it actually does something, and you have a splitter in the front, or for sure, if you have a formula car with a front wing and a rear wing, or a prototype kind of car, that has what I would call rear aerodynamics, you got to get that close first, because that can overpower everything. If you have too much rear wing in it and understeers like crazy in high-speed corners, I don't really care what springs, what bars, what shock settings you have. It's going to mask all of that. So if you have a car like that, get the high-speed corner so it's reasonable. So it's not just massive understeer every place or trying to spin out. Get that close first with your wings and your splitter and your, maybe ride height if it's a prototype with a, big splitter in the front or whatever. You got to get that right first, because the rest of it won't matter.
Okay, so pretend there's no aero. It's a non-aero car now.
Okay, then I'm back to what I can most easily change.
And by the way, you have all the springs, you have all the bars, you have all those things, you have all the tools. You don't have all the time, because that's time we can't change. Right.
So it's then you kind of have to quantify. Then it's quantifying the problem. If you have this massive understeer, let's just use understeer again, where it's like the front tires are just chattering and it's just unbelievable. It's probably not 2 pounds of air pressure is going to fix that. It's going to be something much bigger. So that's when I look at front springs. Man, are the front springs really stiff? Well, I don't know what really stiff is. Well, let's make a big change and make them really soft and go out and try it. And oh, yeah, that's too much. Now it's starting to spin out. Perfect. Cut it in half and go back up, midway. So big changes if it's a big problem, little changes if it's a little problem. And, I can't say I go first to springs, first to bars, first to shock settings. I will say, if you have your shocks kind of in the middle and they're not crazy and your settings are kind of in the middle, shocks would be a fine tuning thing, kind of on the order of tire pressures. Springs and bars would be a higher order, bigger magnitude change before I would start shocks and tire pressures. So I guess that kind of quantifying aero first, springs and bars second, shocks and tire pressures third. Then you have camber, you have your alignment stuff, your cambers and your toes and stuff like that. And that's probably third again. It's probably in that third kind of thing, unless it's massively wrong and you're just wearing out the inside edge of your tire or the outside edge or something like that.
Okay, well, I think everyone listening to this now know that they need to run 31.7 psi in the right front tire, 32.6 in the left front. They should have 900-pound springs in the front and 1,500 in the rear. 1.25 inch front bar and a roll bar. Anyways, forget that. So, yeah.
But remember, if it's over 30 degrees Celsius, then you got to drop each tire by 0.2 bar.
Okay.
Then you'll be perfect. That'll work great.
Perfect. Okay.
Right.
No sarcasm in those last few minutes.
No, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So I got one for you then.
Okay.
This is this came from Samir. And
yes. This is gonna be tough because I know it's coming from Samir then.
Right. And if people don't know who he is, check him out on his website, which I should have in front of me, but I don't. Do you know it? Right off here?
yourdatadriven.com.
That's it.
Yourdatadriven.com. Great stuff. Bunch of stuff. He and I did a tire webinar last year, and really cool. Smart guy.
Super good guy. I think we've both been on his podcast before. And it's amazing. I keep telling Samir, I said, "You're giving that away for free?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "Wow, okay." So lots of good stuff. You got to go there. But anyway, he asked us both, I think, a really good question. He goes, "What works?" He's from England, by the way. So this is, he probably ends up doing this more often than not. But he goes, "What works best in the rain from a driving and setup perspective? What should I do differently, if anything?" And this, to me, is probably the key. I haven't really had this asked before. How can I practice those differences when it's not wet? To me, that's brilliant, because people are like, "Well, I can only practice when it's wet, and I live in Texas and it never rains." Well, so that's a good question. How would you do that, Ross?
So the very first thing that I think of is what do you need to change for the rain, for driving in the rain, from a driving perspective? The very first thing you need to change for most drivers, not all, but for most drivers, is your mindset. Because most drivers look at the rain and go, "Oh, this sucks. I hate the rain." Well, guess what? You're going to suck in the rain if you hate rain. And the sooner you learn to love the rain and driving in the rain, that is for sure the first step. So kind of going to Samir's last question of how can I practice those differences when it's not wet? Well, you can do that in your mind. You can practice driving in the rain. And I have done that. And I've joked about this, and it's a little uncomfortable to talk about this, but I will stand in a shower thinking this shower feels good. It's like driving in the rain. It's like racing in the rain. And it's like, it makes me feel good. And, if it starts raining, I'll go and walk in the rain and think, this is just like driving in the rain. Like, it feels good. So that's the very first thing is if you don't like driving in the rain, you've got to change that. And maybe there's a little bit of fake it until you make it, where you do that, you talk to yourself and you say, "I love the rain. I love the rain. I love the rain." And you imagine yourself in the rain on a wet track and the car sliding, slipping that little bit. And you like that feeling. Like, it's not like, "Oh my God, when's it going to start to slip? When's it going? Oh, there it goes." No, it's, I'm going to make the car slip. And I've shared this story before, but when I guess it was like my first season of road racing, really in a Formula Ford. I first 2 or 3 races. We had 2 races that were in the rain. Living in Vancouver, it rained there a little bit too. Not as much as in England, of course. And I got my butt kicked in the rain. So I started to practice. Every time it rained, I would go and practice. And one of the big things, the biggest lesson I learned about driving in the rain was don't wait for the car to do something, make the car do something. So I would come into the corner and deliberately, maybe what I was doing then was I would deliberately come into the corner quick and then release the brakes a little sooner and kind of unload the front end, make the car understeer. So now I'm coming to the corner and the car's understeering. It's like, oh, I know what I have here. I can deal with this. And, then maybe I would like, okay, now I'm going to deliberately get the rear to step out. And I'd kind of squeeze in the throttle just enough to get the rear to step out a little bit. And I was making the car do something rather than I'm going to go into the corner and when's it going to slip? And that was the biggest thing. And when I started doing that, I started going, whoa, this stuff in the rain is fun because it's not scaring me because I know what I'm making the car do. So those two are, it's a chicken and egg thing, right? It's which comes first, the belief and confidence that you're good in the rain and you love it because of that, or you've found something that works and that gives you that confidence, and they kind of step up together. But if you start off by at least telling yourself, I like the rain and I'm going to love the rain even more when I feel even better, and I'm going to now start to deliberately make the car do something. And when you do that, it just starts to build from there. And then you can get into sort of all these other techniques of, the classic advice in the rain is go and drive the grippy part of the track. And some tracks, the line in the rain is extremely different, dramatically different than it is in the dry. And other tracks, I think of Watkins Glen. The wet line doesn't change a whole lot because they resurfaced it a few years ago. The dry line hasn't been polished, all that kind of stuff. So the wet line is pretty darn close to the dry line. But you can get to some places in Mid-Ohio. I wish all we ever did was we raced in the rain at Mid-Ohio, because there's a track that in the rain, your line changes every single corner, every single lap, because different levels of rain and there's so many of those sealer patches and then a little concrete and a little of this and a little, you're just constantly driving the most weird lines you've ever driven in your life. And you can make absolute magic happen by finding that. If you continue to drive sort of the dry line, well, then, that's not going to help a whole lot. But, again, sort of to Samir's last question of how do you practice that when it's not wet? Well, I would go into Mid-Ohio. If I was going to go to Mid-Ohio tomorrow, I'd look at the weather app and I'd go, if there's even a remote chance of rain, I would be in my mind practicing going, I could try a big rim shot around the keyhole, or I could try kind of, coming up and really squaring the corner off, like coming in deep and then just bringing it straight back on a really super late apex. Or now that I've driven that in the rain, I'm just going to come in and hug the inside and slip and slide until I get to that concrete patch where it's got tons of grip. And I'm going to stand on the throttle there because the car will take off, and then I'll slide all the rest of the way when I get off it. So I'm going to practice all those things in my mind beforehand. And that's just I'm going to be prepared for that. So I think those are the biggest things is, mentally preparing, having the right mindset, making the car do something, look for the grip. And then, there's a ton of other things you can do, but those are the big ones.
Do you think that's really good? I never really thought about make the car do something, because a lot of drivers, they get there and they're not sure what to expect. And as long as it's doing something that they can expect and that they can expect to continue, then they can deal with it. If it's understeering, okay, it's understeering. I got this. I don't like it, but I got it. But if you arrive there and you're like, I'm not sure it's going to spin out or I'm going to just slide straight off the track. That's pretty cool. I think that's awesome. And okay, so here's one for you then.
Well, Jeff, and it is no different than that's what Lewis Hamilton does. That's what Max Verstappen does. That's what Scott Dixon does. That's what, like in the dry, they do that. They don't drive into a corner and go, when's the car going to move? They deliberately, that's what makes Colin so fast. He rifles it into a corner and goes, I can deal with this because
I'll deal with what happens.
I know I know what's going to happen because I'm making it do things.
Yep.
Rather than I'm going to go into a corner and then wait for it to do something and then try to react to it. Most cars are too fast to react to.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then my question would be, if it's not raining and you need to practice this and you want to get better in the rain, I've always thought that the guys who are good in the dry and the rain are the guys that can feel the limit of the tire precisely. So they have 4 tires. They know they're using all 4 tires right to the maximum. And if the grip level is super, super, super high, you're at Watkins Glen in the dry, well, that's just a higher limit. If it's mid-Ohio in the rain, it's just a way, way lower limit. And so would practicing, let's say you just wanted to go practice in the rain and that was your whole thing, but it's dry out. Could you just run on like super worn out, like triple 4 stint tires and it's going to be slidey and they're going to have no grip any place? Is that reasonably valuable for practicing in the rain?
Well, isn't that what we did with Colin? Yeah,
we did.
Yeah. I mean, I was just having this conversation the other day. We can get into the at least in the pro world, and even in like really serious club racing world, where you want to set the car up. And I'm assuming that as an engineer, you kind of want to tune the car with tires that are decent, so you don't get like a misreading, right?
Right.
So we throw a lot of tires at cars, but I think sometimes what we should do is go to a track with the worst tires you could possibly find and spend a day, like almost running them down to the cords and having the thing slipping and sliding. And I think one of the reasons that drivers aren't sensitive to the limit is because they're kind of waiting, and then the tire goes. Well, if you've got a tire that's doesn't have much life left in it, it starts to go a lot earlier. And typically they also are a little bit more progressive. That's why racing schools put street tires on, whether it's the Skippy cars or the Lucas Oil School or what, like they put tires on that have big slip angles, right? And the cars slide around a lot. And, so the driver gets used to the car moving around. And I think a lot of drivers are uncomfortable with the car moving around a lot. Yep. And, every now and then we see a driver that comes up and they're like, just, wow, that guy's got great car control. And you find out they spend a lot of time, driving on ice and snow. They grew up where it's cold, or, they drove their grandfather's pickup truck on a farm in the gravel roads. Like there's a lot of that. They just slid around a whole lot. And they're comfortable with the car moving around.
Yeah.
So yes, like an obvious answer to Samir's last question there is, well, skid pad time. And skid pads are fantastic. And I'm a huge proponent of skid pads, but they're a little bit artificial. And I always think that, all drivers, even the best drivers in the world, should go and spend time on a skid pad. But then you have to go and apply what you did on the skid pad to a track and get used to that car moving around there as well.
I was just thinking about it, if that's the thing, what about, it probably doesn't matter what car you're practicing in, right? You're trying to feel the limit of the tire. What about an indoor go-kart on one of those polished concrete slick track kind of things? That's got to be helpful, right? I'm
a big believer in those things. Like people go, oh, that's just, indoor karting. It's kind of, to me, it's learning how to learn. I'll go to a indoor karting place, and it's like, because there's always one 13-year-old kid there that weighs 67 pounds and has a track record by 4 seconds over everybody else. And then you go, how's he doing it?
Right.
And so it's all about learning. And you get out there and you go, well, this slip, that slide there is too much. Like I slid too much. That I'm not sliding a kart enough. And you kind of keep, kind of honing in on that, how much sliding is good and how much sliding is bad. And so, yeah, I mean, all of that. And again, even when you get used to that, I love the feeling when the car is moving around.
Yeah.
That's, it to the point where it's like, if it's not moving around, this is kind of boring.
And the cool thing about that is that, so you think you're doing this to get better in the rain, that makes you faster in the dry too.
Absolutely. It's the same thing. It's just, it kind of narrows down a little bit. Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And at a higher speed. Yeah.
Yeah. At a higher speed. Exactly. I remember, when Colin was doing Daytona prototypes and he was living at home, he's driving Daytona prototypes all the time. It would rain out. He was still in high school and we homeschooled him. It would rain out here in West Texas, rarely. And we would cancel school and he would go out in the go-kart and run in the rain. Even though he was driving Daytona prototypes and contending for the championship, it was a chance to go drive in the rain. And I know it burns you too, and it burns me when they're practicing. Okay, if it's the morning warm-up before the big race and it's raining, maybe you don't go out.
And it's going to be dry for the race.
Right, exactly. But if it's a practice time or a practice day or any chance you get and it rains, it amazes me why there isn't the most densely packed racetrack ever. I mean, that's what an opportunity, because it makes you better in the rain, but it makes you better in the dry because you get a chance to feel the tires, feel the limit. And, people are like, well, I might crash. And I'm like, yeah, but you're going so slow in the rain, it's not going to hurt anything if you crash. So now's your chance.
Well, and it makes me think about Daytona this year, the 24-hour race. We had all the rain on all the practice sessions leading up to the race day. And then race day was freezing cold. So you spent a lot of time driving on ice cold tires. It was like driving in the rain. Right. So the drivers that spent time driving in the rain were better prepared for the cold tire conditions. So it all helps.
Exactly.
So what's the trick setup then for the rain?
The trick setup is a driver that's done all the things that you just said they should do. That'll get you way better than. Then
the one thing that I forgot to mention is always make sure that you're driving a car that's better set up for the rain than everybody else.
Right. It always helps. That always helps. Okay. So how do we do that? I mean, it's really in one general term, softer. I've always used the old ice skating rink analogy. Take it to its extreme. Yeah. When you're not sure. If suddenly you were on a hockey rink, that was their track surface, what would you do? I mean, think about it. Even if you were walking, you're like one of those cats that's just trying to very gently move and not let your foot slip out and bend your knees and do all of that. Well, the car is the same kind of way. You don't want to put a load quickly into the tire because it'll just break free on the ice or rain. It's what we're really talking about. It'll just break free. So you want super soft springs, super soft anti-roll bars, or maybe even disconnect the anti-roll bars completely. You want lower, tire pressures. It depends on if you're going to run rain tires or not. If you're going to run rain tires, usually go up a little bit on tire pressure to kind of crown it so less of the rubber is touching the road and floats on it. So softer bars, softer shocks, softer springs. And that assumes that it's not going to dry out. Most endurance races that you and I run, rarely are we confident it's going to be rain the whole time. So oftentimes we just end up bolting the rain tires on it and running the dry setup, because if it dries out, you're going to be in a world of hurt if you're on super soft springs, bars, shocks, and all of that. So it's kind of a compromise. But in general, if you can, go softer. And if you only had time to do one thing, like you're on the grid and you're not sure what to do, I would disconnect the anti-roll bar from whichever end you think is going to slide the most. If the thing's understeery normally that's the front bar is what you would disconnect. So, just disconnect it. Just take one link off and send it. And if you're not sure, take both the front and rear off and go. So softer will help. And it depends. I would only make those changes if it's actually raining out of the sky. If it's just wet, it's going to dry pretty fast. It's amazing what 10, 15, 20, 30 cars how quickly they can dry a track and how quickly a dry line will form. The runoffs were a good example this year at Indy. I was helping a guy there. And, it was like raining. He started the race on rain tires, and it had stopped raining about the start of his race. And those races are only like 30 minutes long. 15 minutes in, it was a full dry line. So you got to watch that and kind of, it's a guess, but take your best weather app, take all three of them, bolt them together, and they'll all be wrong.
Yeah. Use the weather rock.
The weather rock, exactly. Yeah. Or just, sometimes just look up in the sky and figure it out.
So we'll finish this one about the rain setup on a controversial opinion that you and I have about aero settings. If you're driving a car that has wings or aero, talk about that, Jeff.
Yeah. So I have a kind of a, probably not the most accepted theory on that, but it's worked for me in the past. So I go with what works usually until I find out it doesn't work.
And it's worked for me too. So that's right now we're 2-0 on this podcast on this.
Okay. Good. It's nice to have somebody agree on this one. The conventional wisdom has always been, it's raining out, add downforce, right? Because you have little grip. And so you need to press the car harder into the ground to make up for your loss of grip due to the rain. And I found, because I did it wrong numerous times by what I thought was wrong by adding downforce, is I found I actually leave the aero settings or take drag out of the car and downforce out of the car. It's sometimes, depending on the driver I have, when I suggest, we should take some downforce out, they're like, whoa, are you kidding me? You got to be crazy. No, I need the grip. So maybe I can get them to convince them just to leave it where it is. That's usually the best I can do. But in the past, I've taken downforce out and done really well, because a little bit of extra downforce that you can put in, let's say you put in even 100 pounds more downforce, it doesn't really make you go that much faster around a corner that's wet. You just can't push it down hard enough to make up for the massive loss of grip in the rain. So I take downforce out, which takes drag out, and I go fast down the straightaways, much faster than them. They got their downforce in, they're slow in the straightaways. I pass them down the straightaway. We get to the corner, and what? Is this guy with a little bit of extra downforce just going to drive around the outside of me in the wet in that corner? Never happens. He's behind you, sprays in his face, and he's like, and you come out of the corner and you're ahead of him. And now you pull him down the straightaway again. And maybe he catches you a little in the next corner and you pull him down the straightaway. It's easy to pass in the rain on the straightaways, much easier than in the corners. So that's always worked for me. But the good thing is I like it. So many people disagree with me on that most people don't do it. So I like that. It helps. It's helped me win some races in the rain by doing that.
Well, and the good news is that you're not actually driving the car at that point, and I'm coaching the driver, and I'm not in the car. So just take all the aero out of it and send it.
Right. All right. Exactly. That's when okay, driver, it's all up to you now.
Yeah. Leave it up to you. Yeah.
So, yeah, that was good. That's good.
Okay. Well, I think we've answered those. We beat those questions up pretty bad. Hopefully we've come up with some slightly less than dumb answers.
I think so. My arrow thing might be dumb, but we need some dumb answer in here, right? Because there weren't any dumb questions.
Yeah. So there we go. And everybody keep learning, having fun. We'll see you in the next podcast.
Have fun, and we'll answer some more questions soon. That was enjoyable. Thanks.